So welcome everyone to this episode of the Australasian Fluid Mechanics Seminar Series. Our guest speaker today is Professor Vincent Wheatley from the University of Queensland. He's the co-director of Center for Hypersonics at the University of Queensland and is an expert in computational, experimental, and theoretical modeling of supersonic gas and plasma flows. Thank you, Vince, for accepting our invitation, and we're looking forward to hearing your talk.
All right, thank you very much, Zado. It's definitely great to be able to talk to you all. So this talk is eventually going to be on the collisional effects on the Richtmyer Meshkov instability in multi-fluid plasmas. This is a culmination of 20 years of work. So it will take a while before we get to the collisional effects because there's a lot of sort of groundwork to lay beforehand. So please bear with me. My co-authors on this talk were my former PhD students and postdocs, Daryl Bond, Kyriakos Tapanou, Shazeb Imran, and Boda Mostert, along with Professor Ravi Samtani of KAUST and Dale Pullen of Caltech. So, hang on. This is a quick overview of the presentation. So I'll begin with an introduction to the Richtmyer Meshkov instability, looking at its common applications and some results in single fluid plasmas, and then go through the motivation for moving to the multi-fluid plasma model. I'll then go through some of the details of our solver for this set of equations. So looking at those governing equations, how they're implemented numerically, and a few selected verification cases. To lay the groundwork, so we have a reference point to compare the collisional effects to, we're going to recap some ideal multi-fluid plasma results, looking at the instability mechanisms, which are enhanced compared to the neutral fluid case, and then the mitigating effect of initial magnetization. We'll then finally get on to the effect of collisions on the plasma RMI. We'll look at the role of intra and interspecies collisions separately, along with the effects of anisotropic transport due to the effects of both self-generated and applied magnetic fields. The final item to look at will be the effect of magnetization on the collisional RMI, and we'll finish up with some conclusions. So what is this Richtmyer Meshkov instability that I've referred to 5 times already? It's usually the instability of a perturbed density interface that's accelerated by a shock wave. During the shock interaction, vorticity is deposited on the interface due to this baroclinic term in the vorticity equation, and that distribution of vorticity on the interface will cause the initial perturbation to grow and roll up, and usually leads to the transition to turbulence and intense mixing between the fluids. The reason we care about this instability is it's very common in flows featuring shock waves, and some of these applications are very significant. For example, in astrophysics, it's been used to explain the lack of stratification in supernova remnants. It's also been used to explain the massive amplification of magnetic fields in supernovae, and it's required in stellar evolution models. In inertial confinement fusion and related processes like magnetized inertial fusion and magnetized liner fusion, the instability drives mixing between the fusion fuel and the capsule that contains it, which limits energy production. In hypersonic vehicles and facilities, it can have a positive or a negative effect. So in supersonic combustors, it can enhance mixing between fuel and air, which is a benefit, while in impulse facilities, it often limits test time by driving mixing between the test gas and the driver gas that propels it. The application which we first paid attention to in the group of collaborators that I outlined before was inertial confinement fusion. This is because our research was initially sponsored by the US Department of Energy, got a major program in this area. So for those not familiar, inertial confinement fusion is a technology where a capsule about 2 millimeters in diameter contains a deuterium-tritium fuel mixture. This is then either directly or indirectly irradiated with high-power lasers, and this ablates the surface of the capsule, driving a shockwave into the fuel contained within it. At the hotspot at the center of this implosion, you get conditions sufficient to ignite fusion reactions. And if everything goes well, a fusion burn will propagate through the inertially confined fuel. In this scenario, the Richtmyer-Meshkov instability acts on the various interfaces in the capsule and drives mixing between that capsule material and the fuel, which is highly detrimental to the fusion burn. So in a review of the National Ignition Campaign in the US, these instabilities, along with low mode asymmetry, were identified as where improvements need to be made in order to improve the implosion performance, to avoid the imploded capsule looking like this image from one of Dan Clark's simulations of capsule implosions. Now, improvements were made. The drive symmetry, the laser drive symmetry was improved. They switched to making diamond capsules with even smaller initial perturbation size, and they also changed the timing of the laser energy pulses. And all of this resulted in the massive breakthrough of net scientific energy gain from inertial confinement fusion. So in late 2022, more fusion energy was generated in an implosion than the amount of laser energy that it took to drive it. Now, this was far less energy than it took to generate the lasers in the first place, so not yet a viable method of energy generation, but it was a proof of concept that a fusion burn can be achieved in the lab, but many engineering challenges remain before this can be used for any applications. And one clear path forward to improving implosion performance is limiting the mixing generated by these hydrodynamic instabilities. So this kind of brings us to our work in this field, where we've been examining suppressing the Richtmyer-Meshkov instability with the application of magnetic fields. And our work really started when Ravi Samtani, who was at the time a researcher at the Princeton Plasma Physics Lab, was running a Richtmyer-Meshkov instability test case for a new ideal MHD code that he'd been writing. So this is the instability of an oblique planar density interface, now very well developed. And seeing as that was an MHD code, he wondered, what will happen if I turn on a magnetic field? And what happened was quite surprising. The growth of the instability almost completely vanished. So Ravi, along with Professor Dale Pullen of Caltech, decided that the theoretical analysis of this topic would be a great PhD project, and this ended up being my PhD topic. So we didn't know it at the time, but this would lead to a 2-decade collaboration and friendship that began with solving the MHD shock refraction problem and producing a linear model for the magnetized instability, and spanned many projects, grants, and PhD students, such as Voda Mostert here, who is now an associate professor at Oxford. Now, tragically, Ravi passed away in 2022 when he was still at the height of his academic powers. The stream of research which we're going to be looking at today is just a small part of a very rich academic legacy. At the last AFMC, postdocs and PhD students in his group were looking at topics as widely varied as using discrete exterior calculus to produce new numerical methods, to using AI to characterize the plethora of waves present in the type of plasma simulations that we're going to be looking at. It was a privilege to work with Ravi, and he will be missed. I'd like to dedicate this talk in his memory, and we'll come back to Ravi at the conclusion. So after a brief hiatus for a couple of years, we returned to work on the plasma Richtmyer-Meshkov instability funded by the Australian Research Council. We did ideal MHD simulations of the converging instability with different applied magnetic fields in both 2D and 3D, and also did theoretical studies of imploding MHD shocks. And this resulted in 2D and 3D realizable fields being developed that suppress both the Richtmyer-Meshkov instability and the subsequent Rayleigh-Taylor instability while minimizing implosion distortion and not weakening the implosion. The theoretical models and linear stability analyses were also advanced. And in all cases, the suppression of the instability, which we see here, is due to the transport of vorticity on MHD waves. And this can most clearly be seen in these ideal MHD simulations from Voda Mostert's thesis. So we have density contours on the right, where the shock has just passed through the perturbed interface. It's converging inwards. And on the left, we have magnetic field lines. This is a saddle topology magnetic field and vorticity contours in red and blue. Now, the vorticity distribution has already begun to split up and be transported on waves. And as we let this run, we can see this continuing with the vorticity departing from the interface, substantially driving down the growth of the instability. All of the work that we've looked at so far has been in the ideal MHD model, which is a single fluid model. So what was the motivation for moving to a more complex multi-fluid model, which is the topic of today's talk? Well, while we were doing this theoretical and computational work, more experiments were underway. So in 2012, Hohenberger published the results of magnetized inertial confinement fusion implosions, where with the magnetic field, there was a 30% increase in neutron yield, which was entirely attributed to reduced heat losses from the hotspot by confining electrons, not something that we modeled in our simulations. Unmagnetized implosions, such as those by Manuel et al., showed the presence of self-generated magnetic fields, and these could be beneficial by either reducing the aforementioned electron thermal conduction losses or detrimental by reducing the coupling efficiency between the drive laser and the capsule. In both cases, these are not emergent behaviors that are modeled by the equations of ideal MHD. So we wanted to seek a model where both the electron dynamics and the self-generated fields naturally arise from the governing equations. And the model that we settled on is the multi-fluid plasma model, which I'm going to present. So this has a full set of conservation equations for each species, can be ions, electrons, or neutrals. These are coupled to the full Maxwell's equations for the evolution of the electromagnetic field. And when we're modeling collisional effects, we're going to use Brzezinski's anisotropic transport coefficients, which are suitable for a wide range of Knudsen numbers in the highly collisional regime. So the benefits of using this model is it can handle finite plasma length scales, such as the Debye length, which is roughly the length scale over which charge separation can exist in a plasma, along with finite light speed and finite electron inertia. This allows charge separation to develop where appropriate, and self-generated and electric and magnetic fields are emergent behaviors in the model. So let's take a look at these governing equations just briefly. So these are the conservation equations for species alpha, which could be ions or electrons. We'll drop the neutrals for now. So we've got conservation of mass, momentum, and energy for species alpha. So the unfamiliar terms for the neutral fluid community, this term represents the Lorentz force on the fluid. So E is the electric field, B is the magnetic field. These equations are already non-dimensionalized. Some of the parameters here, N is the number density, Q is the particle charge, ds is a plasma length scale known as the skin depth, and B to naught is the ratio of the thermodynamic pressure to the magnetic pressure for the reference state. Now, the key thing I want to point out here is in the absence of these collisional terms, the only coupling between the multiple species is via these electromagnetic terms, and they scale inversely with the plasma length scale. So when we have large plasma length scales, the fields only have a weak effect on the dynamics of the fluids. These final two terms are from Brzezinski's transport model. So the tensor pi is related to the negative of the viscous stress tensor, but it does have a tensor viscosity accounting for accounting for reduced transport across magnetic field lines and diamagnetic effects. R is the collisional exchange of momentum between species, And in the energy equation, we have some additional terms. So Q alpha is the heat transfer or heat flux within one species, and uppercase Q is the interspecies thermal equilibration term. So for completeness, this is our non-dimensionalization. We typically pick the reference mass as the proton mass. We choose the reference length to be the perturbation wavelength that we're interested in for the instability. We choose a reference velocity, which is the thermal speed of the ions usually, which also sets a reference temperature, and that allows us to non-dimensionalize the speed of light. From those quantities, so the Q naught is the charge of a proton, we're able to calculate the skin depth, and from this, the Debye length, which is going to be what is the most useful measure of the plasma regime when we observe the results. So we do have to select a B naught value, which we get from beta. And when we don't have initial magnetization, this is just going to set what non-dimensionalizes these self-generated magnetic fields. We need constitutive equations to close this model. So we have the regular ideal gas law and the total energy definition. And I'm going to give just one example of the Brzezinski transport model, and this is the interspecies momentum exchange term. In these expressions, U is the relative velocity between the ions and the electrons. So this collisional exchange term has a decomposition of the velocity, where each velocity component is multiplied by a separate transport coefficient alpha. So we decompose the velocity, the relative velocity, into components parallel and perpendicular to the fields, and then we have a third component of the relative velocity that accounts for diamagnetic effects. The transport coefficients are then a function of the electron density, collision frequency, and embedded in here, the electron cyclotron frequency. Some of the other terms are also a function of the relevant frequencies in the ions, but these ones are only a function of the electron frequencies. So all of the transport coefficients are similar in that they account for the magnetic field orientation and how this influences the collisional effects. So we need the Maxwell's equations, or some equations, to close the model. So we look at the field evolution. So here we use the full Maxwell's equations, once again, non-dimensionalized. In the multi-fluid plasma model, you can obtain the currents by simply summing up the species number densities by their charge, by their velocity, and similarly, you can obtain the charge density. The first two equations are what we're actually going to solve to evolve the fields, and the last two equations are constraints on their divergence, which aren't automatically satisfied, so we correct the fields with a projection method to ensure the divergence errors don't get out of control. All right, so that's the governing equations. I think there are no more equations in the talk, so we can now relax and look at some figures. So these equations are implemented in a code named Cerberus, which is a multi-headed dog that guards the gates of Hades, representing a multi-fluid plasma, which can be a beast. And this code is hosted on GitHub. We don't have great user support. It's hosted on GitHub in the interest of having reproducibility of our results, should anyone want to cross-check them. The code is, the solver is implemented in the Adaptive Mesh Refinement Framework AMREX from Berkeley, and the primary developers were Daryl Bond, Shazeb Imran, and Kyriakos Tappan. So it's, in essence, a second-order finite volume method, uses Runge-Kutta 2 for time integration, although implicit time integration is also available. It's not used for the test cases we're looking at here. We use the HLC flux of Toro for the fluids, and the Rankine-Hugoniot flux of Moreno et al. For the electromagnetic fields, although some of the earlier results did use a HLE flux, so I'll point those out. We use an implicit treatment for the source terms due to Abgral and Kumar. There are many limiters available, but we're using second-order Van Leer in the results shown here. So the Adaptive Mesh Refinement Framework in AMREX is block structured, as we can see in this example, and has level-by-level time integration. Embedded boundaries, which are only going to be relevant for one test case that I'm showing, are used to model complex geometries. So in the embedded boundary approach, you define your geometry as a function or an STL file. And then we use a cut cell approach to apply boundary conditions. So we use the cut cell flux of Pember and the gradient calculation of Sverdrup. To avoid small cut cells that limit our time step, we have an algorithm that recursively merges boundary cells such that when you cut them, both of the cut cells have reasonable volume. So in this example, the cells of the same color are merged together before cutting. So I'm now going to show a few of the validation and verification cases that Cerberus has been subject to, the ones which are most relevant to the present problem, but there is a whole host that have been done. The first case is the simulation of a neutral fluid Richtmyer Meshkov experiment by Model et al. This is a Mach 1.95 shock driving a perturbed helium sulfur hexafluoride interface. And here we've got the final evolved state comparing the CFD and the experimental solution. The strange visualization from the CFD was for a code-to-code comparison, which is not shown here. What I want to focus on is the history of the interface width, which is really the growth of the instability, where we can see really good agreement between Cerberus and the experiment, with the slight overprediction in growth at later times, likely due to the fact that this was an Euler simulation, so lacking viscous dissipation. So that's the Euler solver within the code. We're going to be highly reliant on having accurate time-varying magnetic fields. So our test case for this independently is a EM waves generated by an oscillating line current in close proximity to a perfectly conducting cylinder. So the Cerberus solution contours are on the top, the reference solution is on the bottom, and then we also have the profile through a slice through this red dashed line, where we can see we've got excellent agreement between the two. So just to illustrate what that looks like when it's an unsteady case, we have now waves generated by a waveguide, which is once again interacting with a perfectly conducting cylinder. In this other example, it's interacting with a more stealthy shape, and we can see this substantially reduces the reflected waves in the direction of the waveguide. But this is just for fun, it's not an actual validation case. Now, what's directly relevant to the present case where we're looking at collisional effects is a test case which can validate those collisional terms. We have done code-to-code validation for the collisional terms, but there is one analytical case we can compare to, which is a two-fluid plasma Hartmann flow. This is like Couette flow, but with an out-of-plane applied magnetic field. And an incompressible two-fluid solution to this was derived by Miller in 2017. And here we compare to his solution for the set of non-dimensional parameters shown here. So we have excellent agreement between the profiles of the magnetic field in two directions, and very good agreement, this is on a relatively coarse grid, with the current in the Z direction, except we don't quite get these sharp peaks. The reason why the Cerberus solution doesn't extend as far is we're only showing the cell center values internal to the domain. So you can kind of get a sense of how coarse the grid is by the distance between the last cell center and the actual wall location. But from this, we're reasonably confident that Cerberus is providing an accurate solution to the model equations. So we can now start to look at some solutions. So to have something to compare the collisional effects to, we're going to look at some ideal cases with no collisional effects. So this is our generic initial condition for the Richtmyer Meshkov problem. We have a driver state S0 and then two states S1 and S2 that set up the perturbed density interface. The driver state in the ions is set to the conditions downstream of a Mach II ion shock. So we should see a single shock in the ions propagating forward. and the electron driver state has the same temperature, velocity, and number density to maintain charge neutrality and equilibrium in the initial condition. Because the electrons have a vastly different sound speed, this is not going to give a Mach II electron shock. It is going to give a general Riemann problem, which has initially unpredictable results. The density interface in this case has a density ratio of 3, and this is due to a discontinuity in temperature. So we refer to this as the thermal interface Richtmyer-Meshkov instability. So the problem parameters in non-dimensional form are shown here. Now we have slightly de-stiffened the problem by having the electron mass being 1% of the ion mass, which is 18 times its true value. But there's still a large separation in scales. We're looking initially, so our reference temperature is roughly the temperature in the center of an ICF capsule implosion. That makes the reference velocity very high, so our non-dimensional speed of light is only 100. Also helps to de-stiffen the problem numerically. And we're going to look at a very weakly coupled case. So the Debye length is going to be 10% of the perturbation wavelength, which is very large. And this means that the fluids are going to be very weakly coupled. Like this large plasma length scale is going to mean that there is weak interactions between the two fluids, which is only by, if you remember, via the fields, and that affects scales inversely with the plasma length scale. So if we convert this non-dimensional Debye length to typical Debye lengths in ICF capsule implosions, then our problem scale would correspond to very small perturbation wavelengths from like 1 to 100 nanometers. The reason we're looking at this very weakly coupled case is it's going to exaggerate the multi-fluid effects by allowing large-scale relative motions between the species. So what we want to do is understand those effects in this weakly coupled case and then apply them to a more realistic smaller length, apply that understanding to a more realistic, smaller plasma length scale case subsequently. Now, before we look at the multi-dimensional results, I just want to examine the 1D wave motion that's underlying the Richtmyer-Meshkov solution. So these are space-time wave diagrams for the ions and the electrons showing the wave motion. So in the ions, we have a pretty standard picture where a shock wave propagates and excites the ion interface here, generates a transmitted and a reflected shock, and accelerates the interface to the right. In the electrons, we have a much more complex picture. So that general Riemann problem at t equals 0 sends a very fast wave in the electrons that excites the electron interface before that wave decomposes into a dispersive wave packet. Now, when the high density electrons behind the interface get accelerated to the right, the ions are still stationary, so charge separation develops, an electric field forms that pulls the electrons back towards the high density ions. So we start to see the interface curve backwards. Now, this is essentially an undamped system because we don't have collisional effects. So the electron interface essentially begins something like simple harmonic motion, and that's going to subject it to a variable acceleration Rayleigh-Taylor instability, which we'll see massively destabilizes it. So let's now move to the multidimensional results for this very weakly coupled case where the Debye length is 10% of the perturbation wavelength. We're going to look at the evolution of the ion number density on the top and the electron number density on the bottom. So we first focus on the electrons. We see that violent oscillation of the interface at early times. The interface becomes unstable, high wave number secondary instabilities develop, and it rapidly rolls up and becomes chaotic. We have fairly long-lived electron vortices forming, and if we examine the behavior of the ions, we can see the shadows of those electron vortices deforming and perturbing the ion fluid. Now, even though the ions are evolving slowly in comparison to the electrons, we'll see in a moment that the instability is greatly amplified compared to the neutral fluid case, which remains almost sinusoidal with no high wave number instabilities. So we have significant amplification of even the primary mode of the instability. And we can understand this if we examine how the fluids are interacting electromagnetically. So here we have the evolution in time of the charge density, the X and Y electric fields, the Z magnetic field, which is self-generated, and the X components of the Lorentz forces. Now, what I want to focus on is what's causing the massive destabilization of the ion interface. And the primary driver of this is this band of positive charge that develops downstream of the ion shock, transmitted ion shock, which is quite long-lived. This generates a negative X electric field at ion interface location, and that forcing is in the Rayleigh-Taylor unstable direction, which is also long-lived. So the relative motion of the electron and ion fluids is setting up a destabilizing electric field-driven Rayleigh-Taylor instability, and that's what's responsible for the enhanced growth of the primary mode, while those high wave number secondary instabilities are seeded by the motion of the electron interface. And we can see just like how destabilizing the effect is if we compare the hydrodynamic case, where here we've just removed the charge from the ions, to the two fluid case with, this is just looking at the ion fluid. So we see the neutral fluid case, the interface remaining almost sinusoidal, beginning to go nonlinear, but no evidence whatsoever of high wave number secondary instabilities, and really greatly enhanced growth of both the primary mode and secondary instabilities in the multi-fluid plasma case. Now, one thing which is very obvious is we have a greatly enhanced shock speed in the multi-fluid plasma case. And this is because of the electrons which have moved fast to the right, kind of dragging the ions behind them. So this case, this hydrodynamic case, is one of two potential cases we can compare to. So we obtain this by simply removing the charges from the ions, so there's no longer any electromagnetic interactions. And that's appropriate to compare to a multi-fluid plasma case where we've got very weak coupling between the ions and the electrons. There is another limit that we can explore, which is relevant to strongly coupled plasmas, where we combine the ions and electrons into a single uncharged fluid, which has double the pressure, but almost the same density, because the electrons don't contribute much to the mass density. And we'll see examples of that other limiting case in a couple of slides' time. In that case, because you've got double the pressure, same density, you get a higher shock speed. But still, the interface remains without secondary instabilities and doesn't roll up. So we saw those long-lived electron vortices did influence the instability of the ion interface. And Dan Chung from Melbourne, in an earlier version of this talk, pointed out that in 3 dimensions, these electron vortices would be subject to 3D instabilities and wouldn't be so long-lived. So we took this on board and did a 3D version of the same simulation, where here we're visualizing in blue an isosurface visualizing the ion density interface, and there's going to be a transparent visualization of the electron interface over the top of this. So the shockwave passes through, excites the two interfaces. We see the very rapid development of the transparent electron interface and the slower evolution of the ion interface in between, underneath. But we can see that despite the presence of 3D instabilities, the ion interface has still gone highly nonlinear, developed secondary instabilities, and begun to roll up. So the presence of 3D instability did not bring this closer to the hydrodynamic case. Rather than exploring the 3D case further, I now want to return to 2D because it's easier to understand some of these physical effects in a simpler setting. And now I want to look at a more realistic case where we've reduced the plasma length scales by a factor of 10. So these plasmas are now much more tightly coupled together. So once again, visualizing the ion and electron number densities. Now, after some initial high wave number instabilities evolving in the electrons, we can see that the fluids now almost co-move. And despite this tighter coupling, we still see greatly enhanced instability, where we've got much greater growth of the primary mode compared to the neutral fluid case, a filamentation instability on the head of the spike and bubble, and Kelvin-Helmholtz active at high wave numbers along the neck of the structure. And this is driven by exactly the same phenomena that we saw in the large plasma length scale case, only now the relative motion is occurring over a much smaller length scale. But the driver, that electric field in the Rayleigh-Taylor unstable direction, is still present. So it appears that in the multi-fluid plasma model, the ideal Richtmyer-Meshkov instability is much more severe than you would anticipate from a single fluid model. So the next question that we asked ourselves was, well, can it still be stabilized by the presence of an applied magnetic field, as Ravi saw in his ideal MHD simulations? So what we're looking at here is the application of a magnetic field in the X direction, which is quite strong. The magnetic pressure is 10 times the thermodynamic pressure. So in the two rows of figures, we've got the behavior of the electron and ion number densities, where the top half of each figure is a magnetized case and the bottom half is an unmagnetized case. And we're looking at a range of plasma length scales. So large plasma length scale, medium, these correspond to the two cases that we just looked at, and a very small plasma length scale case, which is 1,000th of the perturbation wavelength. The last two figures are those two different hydrodynamic limits. So one with just uncharged ions, and then the other one with both fluids combined into a single fluid, where we can see we get the faster shock, but still no roll-up of the interface. So if we start with the large plasma length scale case, and let's focus on the ions. These dashed lines over the top show the behavior of the neutral fluid cases. We can see that when we apply the magnetic field, we do get some mitigation of the growth of the primary mode, but the instability is still growing to a similar extent. And this is to be expected because, like the large plasma length scales not only limit the electromagnetic coupling between species, but also the influence of an applied field on the behavior of the fluids. When we move to the medium plasma length scale case, we can now see that we've got a significant decrease in the growth of the primary mode, but we still have the presence of a high wave number filamentation instability, which is now constrained to more or less grow along the magnetic field lines. Finally, when we go to the very small plasma length scale case, we have almost complete suppression of the growth of the instability and no evidence of high wave number instability. If we examine the statistics of the interface behavior, so the top line is the growth, the interface perturbation amplitude. Second line of figures is the growth rate. And the third is the circulation on a half period of the interface, which is what drives the growth. We can see that these trends are very clear. So the red curve is the magnetized case. The black curve is the unmagnetized case. So we get mild suppression for large plasma length scales, significant suppression for the medium, and almost complete suppression of growth for the small plasma length scale case. The interesting fact that we see from these figures comes when we examine the circulation. The lack of growth of the perturbation is not due to a complete removal of the circulation, but rather that the circulation in the Z direction, which is what's driving perturbation growth, is oscillating in time. And in the medium plasma length scale case, the reason we don't see complete suppression is we only have less than a single cycle of that oscillation. And in the small plasma length scale case, we don't even have a quarter of a period. So what's driving this behavior? We can see this if we examine the vorticity transport for these cases. So the vorticity is initially negative on the top half of the interface. For the weakly coupled case, we see it stays negative and stays almost as strong, so minimal suppression is occurring. When we go to the medium plasma length scale case, we see negative vorticity at the start, but by halfway through the simulation, non-dimensional time of 0.5, the majority of the vorticity has become positive. That's going to invert the direction of the growth. In the smallest plasma length scale case, the situation becomes a lot clearer. We now have very apparent transport of vorticity on plasma waves, and this leaves the vorticity on the interface less intense, but it's still driving off these waves carrying vorticity of opposite sign. Now, if we pick the point of peak vorticity on the interface and plot how it varies over time, we found something quite interesting. So we didn't just plot the Z component of vorticity, we plotted all components. And it turns out that it's not an oscillation in just the Z component. What we're observing is a slice through a rotation of the vorticity vector about the magnetic field line. And the component responsible for growth of the perturbation is therefore alternating with time. It's also decreasing because as this is occurring, waves are being driven off, which are removing circulation. Now, this rotation of the vorticity vector, if we examine the vorticity equation, which we just get by taking the curl of the momentum equation divided by density, is due to the curl of the magnetic component of the Lorentz force. So this was a suppression mechanism that we didn't see in the single fluid plasma case. Now, we did do some further work on the ideal case. We looked at the influence of different interface types and also the imploding cases, but we're going to leave those behind so we can get on to the collisional effects. I will try to wrap this up in 5 minutes. We'll see how we go. Now, the collisional modeling was primarily the work of my PhD student, Kyriakos Tapanou, who's now a postdoc at the University of Sydney doing solar physics. As of Sunday, a couple of weeks ago, he's now also a married man, so it's a big year for Kiri. Congratulations to him. So when we want to study the collisional effects, we need to choose a plasma state to base these investigations on. So we selected a point along the implosion pathway of an inertial confinement fusion capsule. So we have a reference temperature of 1,000,000 Kelvin and a skin depth that corresponds to a number density of 10 to the 31. And we can see that this is very close to the conditions identified by WHO in 2015 as a point along this capsule implosion pathway. Now we have maintained the same density ratio and incident shock Mach number from the ideal cases, just for comparison. And we also chose to initially investigate small perturbation wavelengths, so only 10 nanometers, which is pretty small even for a 2 millimeter diameter capsule. And this was to get a low Reynolds number where collisional effects would be dominant, so we can readily interpret them, just like we looked at the large plasma length scale cases when we're first investigating the ideal case. So the remaining parts of the initial condition are specified here. So in this set of results, we're looking at ion and electron density and the temperatures, and we got 4 rows of results. So the first row is the ideal case with no collisional effects, similar to what we saw before. The next row, we have only intraspecies collisional effects active. So this is like viscosity, thermal conductivity type effects. Then we have only the interspecies collisional effects. So this is interspecies drag, no viscosity. And then finally, all collisional effects. And in this case, we're looking at the isotropic version of the coefficients because we have no applied magnetic field. So there have been some in the literature who speculated that when you only have a weak self-generated field, the anisotropic transport isn't necessary. And we're going to investigate that claim with the next 2 sets of results. So when we turn on the intraspecies collisions, if we just focus on the ion densities, it's clear that these have dissipated the high wave number features. So the high wave number secondary instabilities have largely vanished, as have the high frequency waves. The growth of the primary mode looks to only have been slightly dissipated. We'll look at the statistics later. When we turn on interspecies collisions, we get almost the polar opposite picture. The high wave number instabilities are still present and have grown to a similar extent, but the primary mode has remained almost sinusoidal. So the interspecies collisions have arrested the large-scale relative motion of the fluids that set up the electric field which destabilize the primary mode. And so as soon as these are active and very strong, that mechanism has been largely removed. When we turn on all collisions, we get the combination of the two. So both the high wave number secondary instabilities and the destabilization of the primary mode have been removed, and we've returned to the nice, slowly evolving sinusoid that we saw in the hydrodynamic case. Now, this, once again, is for a very collisional flow where we have a Reynolds number of approximately 10 based on the circulation deposited on the interface, which might sound low, but it's still larger than the Reynolds number of 4, which is predicted at the center of an ICF capsule implosion. So next, we're going to look at the effect of coefficient anisotropy. So we now switch to the anisotropic version of the coefficients, so the full Brzezinski model. And if we look at the evolution of the ion number density, comparing it to the previous slide, here we've got minimal roll-up of the interface. The roll-up is now much more advanced, indicating that even though we have a very weak self-generated field in this case, the anisotropic coefficients are still affecting the growth of the instability. So the suspicion by Manuel et al. That these self-generated fields were important for the evolution of these implosions seems to be borne out by these simulations. The other difference is that when all collisional effects are turned on, when we use the anisotropic coefficients, I don't know if you can see this, maybe you can't, but there are still some micro instabilities on the interface. The interface is a little bit hairy, just like myself, hasn't done a good job shaving. And this is a dual layer instability that we might take a brief look at in a moment. The reason why all of these effects are occurring is that when we turn on the interspecies collisions, these currents, which are due to the relative motion between the species, are being greatly diminished, which kills off the fields, self-generated fields, which were driving that enhanced instability. There are still fields present, but their order is of magnitude weaker in the bulk of the plasma than in the non-collisional case, the ideal case. And we can really see the action of the various terms, collisional terms in the Brzezinski equation. So these first two columns are interspecies collisions in ions and electrons. The last column is interspecies collisions in the different conservation equations. So we see those interspecies collisions are dominant in the bulk, arresting that large-scale relative motion between species, while the interspecies collisions are active in dissipating those high wave number features on the interface. That hair that we saw on the instability when we activate all collisional cases, this is due to a dual layer of charge that forms just due to heat conduction, because we didn't have a discontinuity in electron temperature across this interface. And when a dual layer of charge forms, you might assume that the fields will just snap it back together and neutralize. But that doesn't happen because everything likes to be unstable. So what happens is the two layers of charge interpenetrate with each other, leading to this sort of unnatural shaped instability from a fluid dynamic perspective. Now, this occurs at very small length scales, which were quite hard to visualize in the complete visualization. So we went on to look at the effects of magnetization. For this, we did increase the perturbation length scale to 100 nanometers, which is more realistic for the targets, but we did a reduced number density, so we go a bit off capsule implosion pathway. I'm just going to skip through this so we can finish roughly on time. So we looked at the effects of zero magnetic field, a very strong magnetic field, about as strong as you get in magnetic confinement fusion, and then a ridiculously strong magnetic field. And we look at both the isotropic and anisotropic transport coefficients, and there's a very clear trend. So we suppress the growth of the instability with increasing field strength, and you always get slightly greater growth when you account for transport anisotropy. This is confirmed if we look at the interface statistics. The growth rate is the easiest to see, where we get that significant drop in growth and always slightly greater growth with anisotropic coefficients. So the magnetic field is still effective in suppressing the instability, even when we have like all of the collisional effects present, which are also suppressing the growth of the instability, but there's no longer any transport on MHD waves. If we look at the breakdown of the rate of change of circulation on a half period and relate it to all of the terms in the collisional multifluid plasma instability, it's chiefly the interspecies drag and the viscous terms that's opposing the baroclinically generated circulation, with the largest inviscid contribution still being the curl of the Lorentz force. So still contributes to suppression, but is no longer dominant. So I'll just leave you with some conclusions. This is where we got to after 20 years of research. So I think Ravi was very happy to see that he started off with a great discovery that you could suppress this instability, which was detrimental in inertial confinement fusion. In the middle, we introduced a lot of new physics that made it seem like this instability was much worse than we thought. But in the end, we sort of managed to bring it back to a slowly growing sinusoid, which is ideally what we want. The next stages are really to look at the earlier stages of the implosion, which aren't so highly collisional, but this needs us to implement different modeling for those collisional effects. Okay, so I'll now open it to any questions. Sorry for going slightly over.
Thank you so much for the interesting talk. If anyone has questions, please feel free to either speak up or use the chat. In the meantime, maybe I just ask something. I mean, I have a lot of questions which may not be real questions because it's a new topic for me. But something I was thinking about when you showed the vortex that was oscillating, in that case in 3D, the wavelengths of that oscillation or the frequency, what does it depend on? Is it the magnetic field that drives that?
So that's related. So that oscillation is related to the plasma frequency. So unlike in the Euler equations, we don't really have a length scale. Without viscosity, we don't have a length scale that naturally emerges. But in plasmas, the plasma length scales are present even in the ideal case, and then associated with those time scales. So those oscillations are related to the plasma frequency, which is kind of just the frequency of plasma will oscillate when you have a perturbation in charge density. I think that's a reasonable way to explain it. So that's one of the interesting things about working with plasmas. We don't quite get the more universal solutions that we get to the Euler equations, because we always have like these length scales and time scales present.
It's interesting. Yes.
Good question. Is anyone else? What about in the room at EQ, Nick?
I also have a question, which is again, I'm not from that topic, so this was a new topic, very interesting topic for me. I was curious, like in the equations you showed about the momentum, the mass equations, conservation mass, conservation momentum. You stated the velocity with u alpha. So in the solver, so this the velocity, so individual field has its own velocity field, or there is some background fluid velocity, or can you?
Yeah. So yes, each fluid has its individual velocity. And the heavy species velocity is kind of like the background velocity, because if you did a mass weighted average, then that would be the bulk of the momentum of the fluid. But yeah, so they are able to move completely independently, but they are regulated by the fields that develop if they move too much relative to each other, which corresponds to a current, or by the collisional terms when we have the collisional effects present. But we do have, however many fluids we have that many independent velocity vectors and energy states tracked, which allows us to simulate those finite plasma length scale effects.
Very interesting. Yeah.
So we did have a question in chat. So we didn't use implicit Runge-Kutta 2 as the time integration. We're using explicit RK2. There is an implicit solver available, but we didn't use it in this work. What we find is the plasmas are badly behaved, and they love to have oscillations, which we need the small time steps to resolve. So we didn't use the implicit solver in this work. But the benefits of using the AMREX framework is that there are a very large, there are multiple linear system solvers available, which allow you to readily implement a wide array of different time stepping schemes. So we used AutoDiff to generate the Jacobian for implicit time stepping, but there are multiple options available because like many different numerical methods have been implemented in AMREX. So that was a question in chat from G.
Hey, Vince, you mentioned that for future work, you need a different collisional model for earlier phases of the implosion.
Yes.
Why is that exactly?
So the Roginski model assumes a highly collisional plasma, where there is a near equilibrium distribution for each of the species. And it applies over a certain range of Knudsen numbers. And early on along the implosion pathway, we don't satisfy those criteria. So unfortunately, we need some non-equilibrium distributions in order to accurately model it. So for the early stages where the collisional effects are weaker, we actually need a more complex model for those collisional effects, which we have yet to implement. I mean, we of course could run some simulations with the existing model, but we would be slightly outside of its range of applicability. All right.
May I also ask another technical question? In one of your slides, you mentioned that for computational efficiency, you were mixing small cells together. This at the interface.
Yes.
Can you explain that more? Why are you doing that? It's how do you actually do it? It means you have a fine grid, and the grid is made coarser at each time step, or?
Oh, yeah, I see. Yes. Let me just go to the relevant slide. It's in the numerical methods. Okay, so this little picture is our example picture is for a uniform grid, more or less. Now, the reason why we're merging cells together is sometimes when you cut cells, like subdividing a cell into two parts, like you can get tiny slivers of cells where if you compute the Sable time step for those cells, it's extremely small, which greatly limits the time step you can take on that level. So our solution to this is to merge the cells However, we're only merging cells on the finest level of the AMR. So we use adaptive mesh refinement to greatly refine the cells around the solid boundary. But then we kind of slightly unrefine them if those cells would be too small when we cut them. So the reason for doing this is to make sure we're able to take a time step, which is like what we would expect for the finest level of the grid, instead of maybe 1,000 times smaller if we have a really small cut cell. But yes, it does come at the price of slightly coarsening some of the cells on the boundary.
Okay.
So when we have another test case, I haven't shown it, which tests the order of accuracy of this scheme for just like a circular wet flow, with where there's an exact solution is known, and we get an order of convergence. And actually be in the backup slides. Hang on. Is it? Oh yeah, there we go. I can't see on my screen what the order of convergence is. So we get, so this is circular wet flow compared to an exact solution using that cut cell method and the embedded boundaries. And the observed, so this is only a second order method, the observed order of convergence is about 1.6. And I think part of the reason why it's not 2 is because of this, local coarsening of some of the cells. But we still achieve, better than first order convergence using this cut cell and cell merging approach.
Well, thank you.
I think there's another question in the chat.
There's another question in the chat.
I may have one question. Yeah. Thanks for talking. Yeah, the simulations looks quite well. I'm also a user of the AMREX actually. So I want to ask, in your case, because your order, you are using second order in space. So actually, in order to keep the accuracy, are you using higher order interpolation in multi-block or not? Like quadratic or quartic? Yeah.
So we leverage the prolongation and refinement routines within AMREX, which I don't recall the details of now that I think about it. Shazeb is one of the code developers is online. I wonder if he wants to chime in. But yes, so in general, when you take, you usually do need to use some higher order interpolation when you map the solution between grids, particularly around refinement. I hope that answers your question. There's another question.
Yeah. Because I'm also in that, I find, especially for those scales with high wave components, if maybe sometimes need to just do some spatial filtering before averaging down the results to the coarse level. I'm not sure if you have done that here. Yeah.
So
is that helpful?
So in AMREX's routine, like it is a multi-level solution. So it does, like on the coarsest level, it will evolve the solution in all of the coarse cells, like at each time, like in its multi-time stepping routine. And I'm trying to think, I can't recall the exact procedure now. We might have to take this one offline, because one of the problems with leveraging someone else's package is sometimes you get hazy on the numerical details.
Because maybe I still have some bugs, but I find sometimes using the higher order level averaging down can improve the accuracy a little bit.
Yes.
Okay.
Right. So we did have another question from G, who was asking. So there was a picture of the vorticity that's convected by the plasma, and the vorticity at a certain pattern. And the question was, could this arise from numerical instability, and can we assure that it's physical? So for the multi-fluid plasma case, I don't have a complete answer for this. However, the transport of vorticity is also present in the ideal MHD case, usually on slow mode MHD shocks, and in the Hall MHD case. And in those cases, we have analytical solutions for the waves that are generated that transport the vorticity, which match our numerical solutions. And we also have linearized solutions for the full problem, especially in Hall MHD, where we can, compare the theoretical solutions to the solutions we obtain numerically. So we don't have exactly the same in the multi-fluid plasma setting. We don't have those analytical solutions, but the transport of vorticity on plasma waves has been verified in other settings. And we've done extensive code-to-code validation. So if our code is suffering from numerical instabilities, other people's codes are suffering from the same ones, which could be true, of course. But I think because the models should converge in the limit of small plasma length scales, I think we believe that vorticity transport is physical. All right, great question.
Thank you.
Okay.
Do we have any other questions?
May I ask one more question, if I may? Again, just for me to understand the physics. So this two multi-phase flow scenario, you have two densities, density 1, density 2. How big in this kind of simulations, how big is the density difference from just to have an idea?
So it's usually because we've slightly de-stiffened the problem, the electron density is usually 100 times lower than the ion density. It should really be 1800 times lower. But it is different from a multi-phase flow because we're modeling dilute gases. They can occupy the same space and time because we're using a continuum approximation of particles that can be intermixed. So it's not as it's like not the same as a multi-phase simulation where we have discrete droplets, for example, surrounded by gas. Instead, the two gases are intermingled. But due to the fact that collisions within one species, like collisions within the electron species, are much more effective in equilibrating the electron velocity distribution function, and the same is true in the ions. It is a valid approximation to treat them as two gases that are in equilibrium with themselves, but not in equilibrium with each other, and then have those like independent conservation laws, moderated by the effects of fields and collisions. So I hope that.
Yeah, that's very clear. It's very interesting, completely new topic. Yeah, I found it very fascinating. Okay. Yeah, thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone. I also have to go, so it was a pleasure to present to you all.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for your talk.
Thanks, everyone.
Everyone for joining.